Good day and welcome to the Orange County Real Estate Playbook.
Yeah, buddy.
I'm your host, Hunter Renner, and today we're blessed with the presence of my real estate broker, mentor, and father, Pablo Renner. Pablo, introduce yourself.
So I have been selling real estate now for just over 22 years. And we currently live in Newport Beach and work in Newport Beach. We moved out here 2005. So we've been selling real estate in the coastal region and Newport Beach for the last 17 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, what is this podcast, you must be asking? Well, we realize that the real estate market itself is confusing, let alone the real estate process. As Pablo just mentioned, he's been doing it for 22 years. I've grown up in the business. Who better to explain the business than people who have been around it most of their careers and lives? So, throughout this podcast, we'll be discussing questions that you, the viewer, may have, which you can find on my Instagram, and we'll have question and answering portals there. Then we'll answer them here. We'll go over some processes and real estate terms and kind of break things down into layman's terms so you understand both who to go for or who to go to in real estate and what's really going on in real estate.
Perfect.
Today, we'll be discussing the buyer process, and broker Pablo will start explaining that for you. Could you
Okay.
explain that?
Yeah. So are we going back to how a buyer will get like at what from what point? Do you want to go from the very beginning as when you first meet a buyer?
Yeah, let's break it down. Well,
Okay.
step into the eyes, have those buyer eyes.
Okay.
What does that look like for your average person who is pick up from the spot where, I want a bigger home, I want to
Okay.
move out, I want to take that step into buying a home. What's that look like?
So I guess the first thing is for a buyer to identify their need, right? If it is a bigger home, if they're looking to get a bigger home in the same community, you have to understand that if you don't do a lateral move, that you're going to pay more, right? If you live in a particular area, say if it's a 2,000 square foot home and you want a 3,000 square foot home, well, if it's in the same neighborhood, it's going to cost you more. And if that's not an option, which people say, hey, listen, I want to sell for X, but I also want to buy for X. So you got to give something up. If you're gaining size, then you have to decide, can I move to a different area? In our case, you're at the coast. It's about as expensive as it gets.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want a bigger house for the same money, you've got to move inland more. So I think identifying what the need is first and figuring out, do they want to move into a bigger house, but they want to keep the kids in the same school, right? Because now they got to figure out how to pay the difference, how to come up with the difference in the new cost of the house. So you identify the need, and then once that has been done, either talk to an agent who should direct them to a lender, because a lot of times people feel like they can't afford that much, and they don't realize based on the interest rates. And I know, and as we're doing this podcast, the interest rates are just under 5, which a couple months ago they were in the 3s, right? So the interest rates really have changed dramatically. And as agents, although we know enough to be able to give our clients some advice, the best person to do that would be a lender. So once you've identified the need, is talk to a financial advisor, whether it's a direct lender, a mortgage broker. Obviously, we work with some great people, and we'd like to kind of keep that, so we know who they're dealing with. But a lot of our buyers will have relationships with a lender or with their bank, and so they got private money. So the best thing is to say, okay, now speak to a financial advisor to say, hey, we want to sell our house. We are currently paying, $5,000, $10,000, $12,000 a month, whatever that is. What could we afford? And a lot of people, there's that old saying, you're not married to the price of the home, you're married to the mortgage payment, right? So a lot of times people say, okay, I could afford a $2 million house, but then when they start seeing their monthly payments, they're like, oh, I could actually afford a $2.5 million, right? Because the monthly payment is what you're paying every month,
Which is the mortgage payment.
which is the mortgage payment. And so getting together with a lender to figure out what are you comfortable with. I mean, we get clients all the time that they've got great financial stability, and so therefore they qualify for a huge loan, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's what they want to pay, right? So somebody that says, hey, I'm qualified up to buy a $3 million house, but in reality, that payment is more than they're willing to sacrifice. And so maybe it's a $2.5 million house or a $2 million house that we have to look at, even though they qualify for much more. On the flip side is you want to make sure that they at least qualify for what they're looking for, right? Because somebody could say, well, here's what I want, but can I afford it?
Right.
Right. So speaking with a lender early on is very important. And then after that is getting together with an agent, and sitting down and reviewing their needs in detail. So the more we know, the better it is for us. Because as we're going out there and looking at properties, we could see something that says, "Oh, I remember the Smith. They wanted this kind of kitchen. They wanted this pool. They wanted this backyard."
Right.
We have a client that wants a pool, but they also want a sports court, right? You really don't know that until you actually see a house where you can kind of look at it and say, wow, you could fit a sports club here. I mean, I've seen some houses that have 20,000 square foot lots and you can't fit anything else in them,
right,
because they built so much. And then you see houses with 8 or 10,000 square feet that have plenty of backyard. So again, it's something that as agents you see on a daily basis, and knowing exactly what your client's looking for is really important. Once you've determined that, I think the next thing is to start looking at properties. Okay. And letting them know right now there's a lack of inventory. As of this morning, in Orange County, there were 1,798 houses for sale and active and coming soon. So to put that in perspective, in 2019, in the same period, in late March or early April, there were over 6,000 houses for sale, and we maxed out at about 8,000 for the year.
Wow.
A good market is 9,000, right? Like a healthy market where it's a neutral market, actually bordering on a buyer's market. We haven't had a buyer's market in a decade at least. And so there's a lack of inventory right now. So one of the things to do is with an agent is being able to go look at properties as soon as they become available.
Right.
Sometimes we'll call a client and say, hey, this property just came up. We can show it to you tomorrow. And they're like, oh, we can't see it until maybe a week, because for whatever reason, and I think it's going to start slowing down here, just because the interest rates have jumped up and the inventory is increasing. I think, and we need it, by the way. I think buyers are going to have a little more time to make a decision.
Right.
I think 30 days ago, for sure, it was buyers would see a property, and sometimes they had to write an offer just because it was the only property available. And maybe they didn't check all their boxes, but they figured it was good enough because there was nothing else on the market.
Right.
Okay. And then getting them into escrow. Once you're in escrow, then it's a completely different animal, right? Then you start doing inspections. Lender gets involved. Appraisal gets, you need to schedule an appraiser. You need to read over a ton of documents as a buyer. You got to read the disclosures, the transfer disclosure, the seller property questionnaire, if there's any trust advisories, and a ton of disclosures that the listing agent will provide for a buyer. And normally, based on how you structured that how you structured that offer, let's just go with defaults, right? The default is you have 3 days to bring your money in. So you make an offer, it gets accepted. Buyer has 3 business days to deposit what's called an earnest money deposit, which is literally just locking the property up, saying, hey, look, I'm a serious buyer. I'm putting my money where my mouth is.
Right.
Which typically in this market, we're seeing about 3%. Okay. So if you're buying a $2 million house, you need to deposit and wire funds, wiring into escrow within 3 business days, $60,000.
Right.
So assuming that you go into escrow on Monday, that's day 0. Day 1 would be Tuesday. Day 2 would be Wednesday, and day 3 would be Thursday. So Thursday by 5 p.m., the money is due into escrow. Then the other timeframes you're looking at is the seller. Again, we're going by defaults, right? Because you can change these dates. But on the contract, the default for the seller to give the buyer all the disclosures is 7 days. So within the first 7 days, the seller is going to give the buyer all these disclosures to read, what condition they know about the property, right? Again, not coming from an engineer or an inspector point of view, but as a seller, like one of the questions is, are there any leaks to your knowledge? Are there any loud nuisances? Things like that. Is there an HOA on the property? Do you share a wall? Do you have any kind of litigation with any of the neighbors? Does anybody else other than yourselves have interest in the property? So has there been a death in the property? That's kind of the big one, because normally it's something that you don't disclose on the MLS. But it's a disclosure that comes with every property, and by law, they have to let them know if somebody's died in the last 3 years.
Right.
And there are some buyers, believe it or not, if somebody passed away, even of natural causes, that might say, "Hey, you know what? That makes a difference to me. I'm not interested in the home anymore." And so sometimes they'll back out based on that. So that's the 7 days. During that same time period, and they run concurrent, is the buyer's inspection period, which again is typically a 17-day period. In this market, we're noticing the buyers are shortening that, sometimes even up to 10 days, right? Because they want to make sure that they do everything in their power to get the seller excited about their offer, and to know that, hey, we're gonna do our due diligence in 10 days and not waste your time in doing it in 17.
Right.
So that's the time that the buyer has to do inspections, review all the documents. If there's an HOA, review HOA documents, right? Because if they want to build, if their goal is to build, the HOA will have restrictions. Maybe they want to put a 2-story house, which is allowable maybe by the city, but then you find out the HOA doesn't allow it, right?
Yeah.
So other things is, if you do your physical inspection, you have an inspector come in and he tells you, oh, by the way, the roof is shot. You're gonna have to spend 60, 70,000 fixing the roof or the foundation, or who knows, mold. There's all kinds of things that could come up. So during that period, and this is really important, because I don't think a lot of buyers realize this, and sellers sometimes think that once they're in escrow, the buyer backs out, they get all that money, and they don't.
Right.
During that inspection period, it's kind of like a free look for the buyer, where they can go in, take a look at the house, know exactly what they're buying. Now, this doesn't mean that this is an opportunity for the buyer to request all new fixtures, all this work, right? This is a time where the buyer says, hey, I'm willing to pay you $2 million for this house based on the condition that I see it in. Once I do my inspection, if everything comes back like, it's pretty much what I thought it was, you could move forward. If it's not, for instance, the foundation is bad, the plumbing is bad, electrical is bad. Now, as a buyer, you might look and say, wow, my offer was for $2 million, but I didn't realize I had to put, 100,000 into this. So it's an opportunity for the buyer to do back out, right? And then they would get the deposit back. The buyer would get the deposit back because they're within their inspection period, right? During that time, they could back out without losing their deposit, right? Acting in good faith. That's the key, is that in the contract it states that the buyer and the seller each have to act in good faith, right? That the buyer's not really using that inspection period just to lower the price, because we see that sometimes they don't want to pay $2 million for a house, but they know that's what it's going to take to get it. So they write an offer for $2 million, drag it out, and then at the last minute they try to renegotiate, right? And unfortunately we see it, but that's really not acting in good faith. So acting in good faith means like, hey, I'm willing to pay $2 million based on what I see, barring something that I don't see coming up in the inspection period. If something does come up, like the roof, maybe a lot of times the sellers don't even know it, because they'll look at it like, oh my God, I didn't know that, right? Because they never go to the attic. They don't know if the roof is, falling apart, because we don't have a lot of rains in California, right? So sometimes you don't know that it leaks. So a lot of that stuff comes up during the inspection period, and it does allow the buyer to go and renegotiate with the seller to say, hey, listen, I paid you X, but I didn't realize that all the electrical in the house is about to burn down, right? Or the termites.
Yeah.
We've seen reports where it's like the termite inspector will say that the house is being held together by the termites, right? Because the wood is so rotted or torn up. So that's an opportunity the seller, if the buyer still wants to continue with the escrow, to maybe talk to the seller and say, hey, Mr. Seller, of course we didn't know that, because we don't go in the attic, we don't go in the basement, we don't go in anywhere to look for these things. When we look at the property, we see it from the surface, right? The inspectors look a little deeper. So that's a time where the seller might say, hey, I didn't realize that. No, I'm fine giving you credit for X, or I'm fine fixing this. And it becomes a negotiation for both. Okay. Once that's agreed upon, the seller will say, hey, I agree to do this. However, you need to remove contingencies. That means that you can no longer use this contingency to back out of this deal. Like, you can't come back later on and say, hey, you know what? I realize I'm overpaying and I want to put new doors, and so it's going to cost me $50,000. So now you renegotiate. So what the sellers will do, they'll agree to something, whatever that happens to be, something that's comfortable for them, and the buyer has to accept it. If they agree, if they both come to an agreement, then they remove that contingency. Then the other big contingency that's left is the appraisal and the loan contingency. unless you have a cash offer where they don't have a loan contingency. And I'll say, I don't know about most, but a lot of times cash offers will waive the appraisal contingency also, especially in this market. In a normal market, you may not, just to make sure that, hey, just because I'm paying you cash doesn't mean that I'm going to pay you more than the home is
Right.
worth, right? So it's a way for a buyer to be able to protect themselves a little bit.
Sure.
So that kind of handles all the contingencies. Those are basically the three contingencies that go into a transaction. And I'm grouping the physical inspection with the reports, and what the seller gives you, any disclosure, any city type, all that is within. You can break it down into different times. The HOA, you can say, oh, I want 10 days for the HOA, but I'll do 7 days for this.
Right.
But for the most part, you'll normally see buyer inspection period to be the same, so that it runs concurrent. And normally, again, in this market, you could see 7 days, you could see 10 days, but the default is 17.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Mhm.
For those that don't know, would you explain what is this escrow that's so much involved in the home buying
Okay.
process, and what's
Perfect.
the purpose
Yeah.
of it?
So the purpose of the escrow, they're a third party, unbiased, right? So they don't represent the seller or the buyer; they represent both. So the way it works, the easiest way that I could explain it is think of a parent trying to get two kids to agree to something.
Right.
Right? Maybe one kid has a certain toy that the other kid wants, and the other kid has a different toy. Right? But one's afraid to give it to the other one, saying, "Well, I know if I give it to Timmy, he's never going to give me the other toy." Right? So what in this case, the parent will grab both toys and then they switch it. Once the parent has it, he'll give Timmy this toy and he'll give Johnny the other toy. It's kind of what escrow does. Escrow doesn't negotiate. Escrow doesn't do anything but facilitate the transaction. So buyer comes in, gives them their deposit. Escrow holds on to it. So in the case of the seller saying, "Hey, the buyer didn't act in good faith. I want the deposit," and they call escrow, "I want the deposit." Escrow says, "Sorry, both of you need to come to me and sign something telling me what to do with the deposit. If you both agree, I'll do it. If you guys disagree, then you got to go to litigation."
Right.
Because escrow will not, you work with what's called unilateral. They have to work with both clients, have to agree on anything escrow does. So escrow holds on to the deposit. Then once the loan is approved and they've done all they do all the paperwork with title to make sure that the seller has done everything to transfer title to the buyer, clean title. So now escrow says, "Okay, we're ready to close." That lets the buyer know, "Hey, if you give me all the money, you're going to get title to this property." Right? Because the title is what's called clean title.
Yeah.
Which means escrow has looked at it and says, "Yep, Mr. Seller, you were the owner. You've already signed all the proper documents in order to transfer title." So now the seller gets a grant deed notarized by the seller. As escrow gets a grant deed notarized by the seller and holds on to it. And then they get the money from the buyer plus the money from their lender. Right? So now once the escrow has all the money for let's say the $2 million, right? If it's a $2 million house, they have the transfer paper, the grant deed, which they're going to give to the buyer once they pay off the lien holder. So like if the seller owed, let's say Bank of America, $1 million, escrow has $2 million in their hand now. So they send $1 million to Bank of America,
Right.
because that's one of the documents that they would have had signed from Bank of America saying, "We're going to release this lien and you can transfer title once we receive the $1 million." Right? So escrow has this whole list. Like, oh, we got to pay that guy. We got to pay the county recorders for taxes. We got to pay the HOA. They pay off everybody who has said, "This is what's owed to us," in order to transfer title.
Okay.
Once that's done, they wire all this money. Then they give the grant deed to the title company, who then physically has to go to the county recorder's office to get it stamped to say, "Okay, buyer is now the owner of the house."
Right. So that's all title is.
That's all title is. Well, not all, but that's their big their big role in escrow.
Right.
is getting that confirmation. What title does is what they're saying is, "Hey, we've looked over all this paperwork. We've done what's called an SI, it's a statement of information. So we've done a chain of title search." So let's say the seller is, Bob. So we've looked at Bob. Bob owns the house. He owes B of A. He doesn't owe anybody else. He doesn't have any kind of litigation or any liens on the property, because there could be a contractor. Let's say Bob hired a contractor to do windows. He never paid him.
Right.
The contractor could put a lien on the property, says, hey, Bob owes me $500,000 or 5,000, whatever that number is.
Mm-hmm.
So what title does, they call that contractor and say, hey, what's going on? Show us proof that he owes you the money. They go to Bob and say, Bob, this guy says you owe him money. He actually filed a lien with the county. What do you want us to do? Bob might say, oh no, here's my receipt. I already paid him. Right. And then they have to dispute that. Or Bob might say, yeah, you know what? I never paid him. Title says, Bob, I can't transfer title without paying this guy. So Bob has to acknowledge that it has to get paid.
Right.
Right. So that's what title does. Title makes sure that once the seller, let's say the seller's Mike, or I'm sorry, the buyer's Mike, the seller's Bob, that when Mike buys that house and he gets that grant deed, 2 months from now, there's not going to be a window contractor knocking on the door and say, hey, by the way, I'm taking all these windows because they're mine because I never got paid for them. Right. So title makes sure that there are no liens or there's no judgments or anything. That's a clean title. Once they go to the county and record it, they call everybody and it's called confirmation. Hey, we got confirmation. That means that it's done. Once that's done, then escrow looks at their books and says, okay, we paid B of A $1 million. We paid the county $5,000. We paid the HOA this much. We paid so forth. And we paid, the Bob the builder, right? Excuse me, for the windows. So what's left, let's say there's like $800,000 left. That's considered net proceeds to the seller. Then usually within 24 hours, escrow will wire the money to them.
Gotcha.
Right. So they no longer own the house. They don't have any loans on the house and whatever the equity was, right? The difference between what they owe and what the home sold for, then that's when they get their check. They get it wired usually within 24 hours. And that's technically how, barring any issues with escrows, which there always is something, is that's the typical escrow period, Yeah.
So from what it sounds like, buying a home is a whole process. It's a lot of hills and valleys and things to go through.
Yeah. I think for the buyer, though, most of the emotion is done before escrow.
Okay.
I think escrow is more of an emotional thing for the seller because they're writing these checks, right? They think, wow, I sold my house for $2 million, but I got to pay this guy, I got to pay that guy, I got to pay the commissions, right? Because the seller pays the commissions for the buyer's agent and their agent. For the buyer, I think the emotional thing is getting into escrow. And of course, being in escrow is emotional because you're buying a house, especially if it's a first-time house, right? Or if it's a dream that you've had. It certainly can be emotional. But I think the more emotional becomes for the seller, especially when they find out, and this happens, more often than not, is buyer does an inspection and inspector says, oh, this is wrong with the house. This is wrong. The windows this, and this is old, right? And the buyer or the seller's looking at this. What are you talking about? I love my house. I live in my house. My house doesn't have all these issues, right? Because you don't realize that a window you never used was broken because you never use it, right? And so I've sold lots of houses where stuff comes back and the seller goes, oh my God, I didn't know that was broken. And or they might be offended because they're saying my house is, my house is in great shape. What are you talking about, right?
Yeah.
So the escrow is, I think, more emotional for the seller as opposed to where the buyer is. Because, from a buyer's perspective, think about this in today's market. You go look at a house. There's 20 other people looking at it. So now you're like, crap, how do I get this house? Well, I got to pay more money. I got all this emotion goes through. And then you tell your agent, okay, write my offer. And you write the best possible offer. And we have one right now where we wrote an offer on Saturday, I think it was, and we haven't heard back from the listing agent. Right. So we're having to report to our buyer, say, hey, we don't have any news. We have no news. No news is bad news, because it probably means that we weren't top 3 at least or top 5. Especially in these markets when you're getting 20 offers as a listing agent, no, you can't respond to every offer that comes in. So most of the time, if you don't hear back from the listing agent, it's probably not good news, and so that's very emotional for a buyer, not knowing. The unknown is the worst thing. And I always say, I had a coach who used to always tell me clients' frustrations are unmet expectations. So I always try to control the expectation of what the client's going to have, and so they're not frustrated through the process.
Right. Of course.
Okay, yeah.
Well, as you can tell, we could talk about this for hours.
Yeah.
Pablo, in the last few minutes we have, in a few sentences, what's the benefit of someone listing or someone getting the help of an agent and the benefit of getting help from anyone here on the renter team?
I think the benefit for our team, first of all, I think you need an agent. A lot of people say, hey, I can do it on my own. It's tough, because even us who do this daily, and certainly do multiple contracts a month, right? As an end user, as a seller, as a buyer, yes, maybe you bought a house before,
Hmm.
3 years ago. By the way, the contract changes almost annually. There's always something new. We just had a huge change to the RPA this year, which is a great change, by the way. I love what they've done. But as an end user, if you don't see it every day and you don't go through training for the contracts, I think it's one way to open yourself up for litigation.
Right.
And that's the worst thing. I think being in litigation after you buy or sell a house. But I think the benefit is that, Nikki and I have been doing this. We got licensed in the year 2000. So here we are, first quarter of 2022. So we've been doing it for 22 years.
Right.
We know how to manage the transaction, not only because we've been doing it for so long, because we've got a team of individuals behind us. We have a transaction coordinator, we have a listing manager, we have a buyer's agent.
Hmm.
We have everybody in place to help us with the transaction. So when we have a deal, we don't stop helping our clients to do paperwork.
Yeah.
Right? We have people who are really good at their jobs. And one of the things, I think Henry Ford was asked, somebody said he was challenged about how smart he was about the cars. And he made a comment saying, I can get you any answer that you want regarding a car. And the guy goes, anything, engineering, manufacturing. He goes, anything. I can answer anything. He goes, I challenge you. And I said, sure. And so he meets this guy in the boardroom, and all his great thinkers were in there, like all his engineers, his managers, his sales, everybody.
Right.
So anytime somebody asked a question, he goes, and he would point to whoever needed to answer. He goes, wait a minute, you don't know the answer. He goes, I didn't say I knew the answer. He goes, I can get the answer.
Hmm.
He surrounded himself with the smartest and best people for each field. And that's kind of what we've done.
Hmm.
Is we've hired the best people for transaction coordinating, for listing manager, for marketing. We
Right.
have the best people in their place. And so therefore, I don't go and tell Ivy how to market. I don't go and tell Mila how to do the transaction, because I know they're better at it than me. My job is to negotiate. My job is to sell.
Yep.
And my job is to take the client out to look at properties and to see the properties. And I know the market. I know the market very well. I've been here for 17 years.
Hmm.
I can look at a house and say, oh yeah, this view is $1 million view. This is not $1 million view. This is facing this way instead of that way. Because that makes a big difference. Which way is the house facing? How good the view is. I know, because of my background, if you'll remember when you were a little kid, and, I was a contractor. So I know a little bit about construction. My background is engineering. So when I look at a house, I could tell, like, oh yeah, you could do this, or you can't do this. Or, when clients want to do certain things, I'm like, yeah, you could do it this way, but it's really cost effective if you do it this way, right?
Sure.
Our goal is to help the client make the best decision in purchasing of a home.
Hmm.
So I think working with us, definitely has its benefits. And of course, we'd love to help anybody out there who's
Right.
looking to buy or sell a house, because we love doing what we're doing. It's a very gratifying job, especially when, the clients moved into their new home, or the clients sold their home. And we just got a text from a client that moved to Illinois. And it was such a nice text, because she said, we sold their house last year, and they've been renting, and they found a house, and she was telling me how happy they were with their house. And she says, I have a good agent, but nowhere near as great as you two.
Mm.
And to me, that was really nice for her to say that.
Yeah.
And so we like to get that kind of response from the people that we help.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time, Pablo. It seems like you have a lot of work to do in taking everything off the shoulders of the buyers and sellers in the real estate
Yeah.
process. So let's get you back to that.
Thank you.
Come back next week for the Orange County Real Estate Playbook. Have a great day, guys.